how sometimes you have a player that is not necessarily the tallest, the strongest, the fastest, which obviously are benefits for playing basketball. But even without those characteristics, some players still manage to be experts better than others. And one of those players that I've liked for a while, Nash, and you'll see he's a lot smaller than the big guys he's surrounding, but he always manages to pass the ball to the right person. In my opinion, that is due to a skill that relates to interacting with other individuals, the constant coupling of perception and action. And my research is kind of about how someone can be skillful in interacting. So for anybody who's still confused about interaction, a little video on what kind of skills he can show, and listen to the commentator.
Behind the back to Daniel, wide open.
Something about Steve Nash, you know, a lot of guys see the game in black and white. He sees it in high definition in 3 dimensions.
Sorry for the quality, I just ripped it off YouTube, but hopefully it was still clear that he made an amazing pass. But hopefully even the commentator was clear, talking about looking in different dimensions, looking in high definition. No matter how much research I can do or data I can collect, that probably captures better interactability than anything I'll produce, but I'll show you my approach on interactability. So keep this in mind, we'll get back to it later on. If we look at sports science, because we're talking about expertise in sports, the past, well, I could say century, I could say 2,000 years, I could say half a century, but generally sports science focuses on individual characteristics, physiological characteristics, later on more and more psychological characteristics, but all individual, which is, in my opinion, and hopefully in your opinion, a bit of a deficit. But fortunately, there's also a lot of research going into team performance. With the team performance, it's especially the interactions between individuals, between agents, that are important. We probably all know that without the interaction, without the relations between individuals, we actually can't say anything about the team performance. Hence the quote, the team performance is more than the sum of the individual performances. Well, the ecological dynamics approach provides a way of taking that into account, and different variables already have been proposed to describe the relations, one of which I think we just talked about it, interpersonal distance in playing tag, or central positions in team play. And these variables are very useful because they look at the interactions, but in my opinion it's still hard to then attribute how someone can be good in interacting. So I started to think more like what kind of paradigms we could use, and I ended up looking at the bimanual coordination. It's basically coupled oscillators. The one direct application might be one-on-one situations in sports because it's also two people that are coupled. But it might still be a difficult link, so let me know if you can't follow it. In my opinion, I can look at how oscillators are coupled, to look at this asymmetry in coupling. I think that is an important component of the interactability as well. So to elaborate more on what is important in the skill of interacting, I made, well, with the help of someone else, made this model of two individuals interacting with each other. If you look closely, you'll see that the beginning of the arrow is a big fat arrow, and then it's reduced. It's kind of representing that there's a lot of information out there, and we try and ignore most of it because otherwise everybody is confused. So what we perceive, so what we're susceptible for, is only part of what is available. Now if you look even closer, you see that the other individual's arrow is smaller. So you could say that some people just actually see less in a dynamic environment than other individuals. So this is a very important basis. He looks the other way, so he sees us. It's a very important basis for my concept of interactability, that there actually is less information to respond on. And if you wonder where this difference comes from, you can actually say that the coupling already is typically asymmetric, even if it's just my mood or if it's how tired I am. If I am coupled with someone else, there's always going to be an asymmetry in coupling. Someone will get a different amount of information than the other person. The only way that you might be able to get a similar coupling would be if you have two computers coupled together. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit what I'm looking at in terms of coupling. And as I said, there's many different ways that the coupling could be asymmetric. Now, onto my experiment. Yes, there we go. I take the visual information, or the lack of visual information, as an analogy for interaction skill. So in this video here, this is exactly the experimental setup. You see two people facing each other, and they have to move together. In the beginning, they have to move in phase, and then at an external cue, they have to switch to an anti-phase coordination. Show you the video first, so that it's clear. So there's two people standing next to each other. They have to move in phase like this, and then you'll hear the switch at one point. There we go, they have to switch. They have to switch to anti-phase. So you can see they have to cooperate continuously. The switch I chose to be able to assign what part of the behavior is contributed by one individual. And the oscillatory movements I chose to be able to say something about the symmetry and stability. Now if you look closely at how they are standing, this guy is watching at the back of the guy in the front. And that is the manipulation I'm trying to lead you into, because this will give us an already very asymmetric coupling. One person can actually see the other, so he has all the information, and the other person, he can't see the other. So he'll have no visual information. He might be able to hear him. They were not allowed to talk. They were not allowed to make a plan. So it just happened on the spot. And this was my method of manipulating how people could interact. So one person has more information than the other. If you then look at the data, positional data, I analyzed it with the relative phase data. You can see here in the beginning, so this is the red line and the blue line are two different people. In the beginning they are very synchronized, so that the phase, the relative phase will be round about 0. Here they have to switch, so you can see that they have to change their phasing, they have to make a complete switch in the couple coordination, and then they go in anti-phase coordination, as you can clearly see at the end. So then it's not 0 relative phase, but around about 5. The good thing about relative phase is that it's a variable that describes couple behavior, as we were talking about before. It's not an individual characteristic, it's couple behavior. But the manipulation of the switch here will allow me to point at how much one individual changed to create a switch from in phase to anti-phase. I'll walk you through those steps in a second to hopefully clarify what I mean with that switch. This is a typical relative phase data of one trial. You see in the beginning, round about 0, and then they switch to round about 3.14 radians. The black dots here are the points of 25 and 75% on the way to the anti-phase pattern. I use those dots to determine the beginning and the end of the switch. The beginning is this dashed line, and the end is this dashed line. If you then look down at this picture, or a little more, you can see that this is where both do the same thing. You know, it's still a bit random, but they do the same thing, and here they both do something different. And that's exactly what I'm going to focus on. The formula to determine the index of coupling is here. Don't worry, I don't like formulas either. Basically what it comes down to is I calculate the proportion of one individual's change in relation to the other individual's change. So you can see here they have an average before the switch. It's almost the same. And then after the switch, this person had a completely different average, or during the switch, sorry. During the switch, this person had a completely different average than this person. Basically the blue person didn't do anything. He constantly did the same thing. The red person, he did all the change. So if as the index of coupling is proportion, that means that 0 is the change of one individual and 1 is the change of the other individual. In this case, this individual would do all the change. Alright. We pose that asymmetry in coupling would function as a function of visual information, and we also think that it is related to stability. These are the less important results. Here you can see, just as in different literature, that in phase is a lot more stable than anti-phase. And here you can see that the bidirectional setting, here when they're looking at each other, is actually more stable than the unidirectional settings. One interesting thing I want to note, but I don't want to elaborate too much on it, is that if you look at the switch duration, which is another measure of stability, but then during the perturbed phase of the coordination, if you look at the switch duration, you can see that it's actually less stable in the setting where they're looking at each other. So those seem to contradict each other a little bit. But then on to the main result. In the main result, we can see that the index of coupling reflects the visual information that is available for the individual. So if you look at this setting, where both individuals have visual information, the index of coupling is round about 0.5, which means that both contribute round about 50% to the switch. So it's not too surprising. Again here, if you look at the unidirectional setting where one is looking at the other, you can see that most was done by one individual. 25% was done by the individual that didn't look at him. And in the other unidirectional setting, same kind of result, only 25% was done by the individual that didn't look at the other individual. So we can see here that the visual information indeed guides how we can coordinate in a dyadic coordination. But what is actually quite strange if you do think about it, that 25% of the adaptation still is done by the person that is not looking at the other individual. So that's something we need to realize. This individual that doesn't see the other still does 25% of that switch I was talking about earlier. 25%. So without looking at anybody, you can still change 25% of the coordination, which is a lot. And made me realize that the coupling is never entirely unidirectional. There's always something that happened in the past that will influence coordination. That is not only the visual information that is available at the moment. If you then relate that back to sports, because that's where it started, you can imagine that if you have less information to couple, that you'll have a disadvantage. This is still a little bit far-fetched and a little bit looking forward, but that's what I'm hoping to end up at one point. The information that someone needs in a one-on-one coupling, the richer it is, the better you'll be able to respond. Last slide on the discussion is that the stability, as expected, was in in-phase more stable and in anti-phase less stable. And the one surprising effect is that in the steady state setting, so before the switch, it was actually less stable, but in the switch itself, it was more stable when it is bidirectional. So that's something interesting to look at. And then for looking in the future, how we want to analyze individuals and their coupling, it is really interesting to see that when you look at dyadic coupling, so two people that are coupled instead of two ends that are coupled, you can actually separate the components, the agents that are interacting. So that allows for manipulation of the flow of information. I had a very simple manipulation of people looking the other way, and obviously there's still some information going both ways. But it does, if you look at the whole concept, allow for more elaborate manipulations. So, as the commentator already said, if you are good at interacting with other people, you actually see more in the environment. There is just an asymmetry, if you're coupled, that is always present, that you be able to extract more information than someone else will. So, hopefully I've showed that the asymmetry is kind of a reflection of interactions, the ability to interact, and in future we'll try and aim to systematically manipulate this coupling between perception and action to get a better answer on how we are skilled in interactions. And you should realize when you do research like that the coupling between persons is always bidirectional. It'll never be unidirectional, but it also won't be symmetric, which basically is interesting. Why it's interesting for people to coordinate with each other. So thanks for your attention. This is on Thursday. That's part 2 of the whole story. Hopefully I have a talk over there. And for now, thanks for listening.
Very nice. I'd like to make one comment on the asymmetry issue. So in the Hauken-Kelso-Bunz equation, a fundamental contributor is the so-called delta omega term, which is a term reflecting on the difference in intrinsic preferred frequencies of the components. Whenever you have one of those present, which I suspect is true in this experiment, then you will always get a drop in the stability of the overall coordination. It's part of the HKB law.
Yep.
So I think you could bring about that asymmetry in a number of ways.
Yep.
However you do it, however you bring about this detuning term, you'll always get a movement of the attractor slightly off of the ideal position, and you'll get or you'll get a weakening in terms of greater variability.
Yeah. Thanks for the comment. That I am aware of that, and it is always confusing. But what I'm trying to focus at is there could be an asymmetry in coupling that stands apart from the delta omega, for example. So even though someone is taller or smaller or faster or anything that could influence the dyadic coordination, you also have something that has to do with just the information flow and not the intrinsically preferred frequency of individuals.
Okay, good.
Is there a way in which the person who cannot see can contribute to the switch? So it looked in the first graph you showed, it looked like what that person did was simply to hang on and keep going in the same direction a little longer while the other guy scooted backwards. So is that a routine strategy that might be under that person's control that they would do?
Yeah. One of the things I hypothesized, or no, not hypothesized, was brainstorming about is how someone can actually contribute to a switch without visual information, which is strange. And you saw that indeed on the graph. Both people had more or less equal adaptation to the switch. I suspect that if the task is to switch between coordination patterns, it could also be a strategy for people to be more predictable for their partners, and instead of just doing one thing different every time, they might just do the same thing every time again and again and again. So it's probably in any kind of task, it's not always just the visual information that is present at the moment that will guide behavior. It could also be the history or that person's estimation of the capacity of the other person. There was one particularly interesting couple where one person, in my opinion, is a very skilled interactor, so to speak, and the other not so much. Whereas the one that was skilled, in my opinion, did not contribute to the switch at all. And I think it is because he thought, okay, if I start to react to what you're doing, then we're going to have a big mess, so I'll just do the same thing all the time so you can do this switch. Yeah. So there's different dynamics mixing.
Yeah, so it's a great study. Once you move outside these kinds of in-phase, anti-phase types of coordination, there's actually quite a lot of evidence to see that you kind of don't want that really stable coordination, and that if you get that, then the system's just going to fall apart, or it's not very flexible. So these asymmetries kind of naturally emerge. I think in your particular experiment, you've kind of imposed that asymmetry, and you're seeing that flexibility in that unidirectional, in the fact that that asymmetry in the coordination is kind of leading towards that kind of slower reaction time, or sorry, convergence to the new pattern of coordination. So, and you kind of see that as being kind of more fundamental to your findings, rather than it being kind of surprising that you found that, when it seems to me that it's kind of what you would have expected given the kind of other research beyond this kind of just strict in-phase coordination.
So you're saying that it is expected. Can you repeat it?
Well, if you go in any kind of natural sport situation, and we've seen this in the other talks today, or any kind of natural social interaction, the coordination is much more intermittent. It's not this fixed, synchronized, coordinated behavior.
Yeah.
And that intermittency actually leads to a more kind of flexible, robust system in general, rather than it just being kind of strict coordination, which is often a result of these natural asymmetries that are kind of embedded in any kind of social interaction.
I suppose you strike a good point, because the main thing that I learned from doing an experiment like this was that there's so much different things going on than just looking at someone, that the manipulation was not a complete manipulation of making the setting unidirectional. So yeah, I suppose I have to admit that in future studies I should look at other factors as well that are a component of this dyadic interaction.
Quick? It could be quick, yeah. Actually, it's about other factors. Just in the unidirectional case, have you thought about the acoustic information as well? They might not be able to see, but I don't play basketball a lot, but I do remember the squeakiness of issues. And I think that actually can provide acoustic information about when you're still not seeing what the person behind you is doing.
Yeah, yes. No, it sure is a factor that could have influenced the behavior. And if that will be the focus, I'd have to admit that, no, you're completely right. It wasn't a complete manipulation of the information flow. Having said that, we wanted to look at a more broad way of how we can influence the asymmetry and coupling. So yes, I didn't completely make it unidirectional, because there's auditory information at that point as well, and maybe some kind of sense that no one knows what it is. Sorry? Yeah, definitely, for sure. But if you look at the focus of the study, what we did show is that the asymmetry is guided by visual information. So it's kind of an in-between answer. Not satisfying yet, but I'll be back for more.
Thank you very much.